I'm dying. It's a fact. There's no need for a doctor to tell me. That farewell performance was something I insisted on doing. I don't want to disappear silently. I have to say goodbye.
The world watched a legend fade, but few truly knew what happened in his final moments. Ozzy Osbourne, the madman, the myth, the Prince of Darkness, did not exit this life in flames or fury. His departure wasn't a crash or a scream. It was a whisper, a soft exhale into the stillness. For decades, he roared across stages, defied gravity, addiction, and death itself. And yet in the end, it wasn't the noise that defined him. It was the silence he left behind, not an empty silence, but a sacred one. The kind that follows a life lived at full volume, a silence heavy with meaning, memories, and love. We often expect final chapters to mirror the chaos of the journey, but Ozzy's last moments did something different. They didn't echo the madness, they brought peace to it.
Guys come in and they're hairy and they're very, from the north of England, and they don't look or dress like anything I've ever seen. And so I was very nervous of them.
His final days weren't spent beneath spotlights, but under soft lamplight, surrounded by the only audience that ever really mattered, his family. There were no guitars screaming in the background, just quiet conversations, faint music drifting from a speaker, and the steady pulse of life narrowing in around what was truly essential. Not fame, not legacy, just love. Isn't that what we all want in the end? And not to be remembered for the roles we played, but for who we were when the spotlight dimmed. For Ozzy, this wasn't a time of regret. It was reflection. A life so loud, now being folded gently into something calm. Children coming and going, their presence not loud or ceremonial, but natural, like exhaling. Grandchildren curled at his feet, unaware of the weight of those final moments, and maybe that was the beauty. In their laughter, Ozzy found the echo of something he never thought he'd live long enough to hear: continuity.
Is that me? Good morning. That's Dad.
Dada.
Dad.
Say good morning.
Good morning.
Proof that the chaos hadn't just been survival, it had built something enduring. The world outside still thought of him as a madman, a bat-biting icon. But behind closed doors, Ozzy had long shed that skin. What remained was the man. Vulnerable, a little broken, deeply grateful. He didn't talk about stages or awards in those final days. He talked about his mother, about Randy, about the time Sharon pulled him out of the void and didn't let go. These memories didn't haunt him, they steadied him, each one like a thread weaving his story into something final, something finished. He didn't fear death, he'd made peace with it long ago. He once said, "A death is just the next tour, without the sound check." And when he finally let go, there was no spotlight. Only light, not the kind you chase, but the kind you walk into when you're finally ready. The house where Ozzy Osbourne spent his final days wasn't grand in the way celebrity mansions often are. It wasn't filled with cameras, entourages, or the loud pulse of fame. It was quiet, purposefully quiet, a place no longer built for crowds but for comfort. Hallways lined with handrails, ramps replacing steps. Every detail of the home adapted not to preserve image, but to protect dignity. It was a space that understood fragility, not as weakness but as the final shape of strength. And for a man who had once set stages on fire, this calm, almost sacred stillness became his final sanctuary. There's something profoundly human about the way he retreated from the world. Not in bitterness, but in a kind of acceptance. We all fear becoming shadows of ourselves, don't we? That our bodies might betray us, that our legacies will outlive the parts of us we still want to hold on to. And yet in Ozzy's retreat, there was no desperation, just presence. The world knew him as a storm, but those closest to him, Sharon, the children, the grandchildren, got to see the eye of that storm. The quiet center, the man beneath the leather and the eyeliner, the father who watched his kids become adults. The husband who still reached out for Sharon's hand when the tremors in his own made it too hard to hold anything else. The sounds in that house weren't of roaring crowds or thundering drums. They were softer, familiar. Music from his past filtered gently through hidden speakers. Black Sabbath riffs played not for performance, but for remembrance. Sometimes it was He Changes, other times Ordinary Man, and in between the music, laughter. The innocent, unfiltered joy of grandchildren who didn't care about Ozzy Osbourne, the icon. They cared about Grandpa, the man who made silly faces, who shuffled in his slippers, who mumbled in a mix of wisdom and mischief. There's something healing in that, being seen without expectation, being loved without condition. Sharon remained his constant, not just his caretaker, but his witness, the only person who had walked with him through every rise, every relapse, every resurrection. In that house, she didn't play the role of manager or protector. She simply loved. And maybe that was the most powerful act of all. She held space for him to let go of the performance. No longer the frontman, no longer the brand. Just a man in the twilight of his life, remembering how it all began and quietly bracing for how it might end. It's easy to picture Ozzy only in extremes, the bat, the blackout nights, the screaming fans. But if you really want to understand him, you have to picture this too. A worn leather chair by the window, a warm mug trembling in unsteady hands, and a dog curled at his feet. You have to imagine the silence, not empty but full of the weight of decades, of mistakes, of victories, of people he lost and people he managed to hold on to. You have to imagine him looking around that house and, for once, not needing to be louder than the voices in his head. That house was more than a structure. It was the living proof that transformation is possible, that someone can spend a lifetime screaming into the void and still, somehow, arrive at a place of stillness. It didn't erase the chaos. It honored it. It held it. It held it. Like the walls had absorbed every version of him and were now gently ushering in the last. There's something beautiful about that. Something brave. Because for all his fire, Ozzy's final act was not to burn out, but to soften. To show us that peace isn't found in the roar of applause. It's found in the quiet moments between. In the final days of his life, Ozzy Osbourne didn't speak much. But when he did, the words mattered. They didn't come in grand declarations or sweeping last speeches. Ozzy was never theatrical in his most vulnerable moments. Instead, it was the quiet things that cut deepest. A lingering glance. A half smile, a hand reaching out, even when the strength to hold on was fading. He never needed to say everything. Those closest to him already knew. But in the little fragments he offered, soft confessions, sudden jokes, broken whispers, there was a kind of closure that words alone could never give. Sharon often said that even when his body began to fail him, his mind remained alert, sharp, tender, and full of stories he hadn't told in years. He spoke about Randy Rhoads more than usual, how he could still hear his guitar in the back of his mind like a ghost that never fully left. "You still see him," Ozzy murmured one afternoon, according to Sharon. "When I dream, he's always laughing. Always 25. There was no bitterness in his voice. No regret. Just a sadness worn smooth by time. Like a wound that had stopped bleeding but never stopped aching. That memory, that laugh, had kept him company for decades. And now it seemed it was preparing to do so again. To his children, he didn't try to be wise or profound. He just wanted them to know that he had been paying attention. That he'd seen their pain, their growth, the way each of them carried some piece of his wildness but shaped it into something softer, something stronger. To Jack, he said, "You were the quiet one, but you saw everything. You always did." To Kelly, "You've got the fire, love, but you never let it burn people the way I did." And to Amy, whose path often stayed away from the cameras, "You chose the hard way, the honest way. That's courage. No formal goodbye, no drama, just recognition." And for them, that was enough. There were also jokes. Ozzy never let the weight of goodbye drown out his mischief. He teased Sharon about her terrible cooking, grumbled about the blandness of hospital food. When his hands trembled too much to hold a guitar, he quipped, "Maybe now I'll finally learn to play it right." And though the laughs were quieter, they came often, especially when he was surrounded by his grandchildren. They brought a lightness to the room that nothing else could. He'd watch them play and mutter, "They've no idea their granddad used to be the scariest man in rock and roll." And then he'd wink. What he didn't say aloud was just as powerful. He didn't talk about the tours, the awards, the excess. None of it seemed to matter anymore. In those final conversations, it wasn't about what he'd accomplished. It was about what he'd survived. The relapses, the guilt, the grief. He'd carry those things silently now, not as shame, but as markers of a life fully lived. When Sharon told him how proud she was, he didn't reply. He just squeezed her hand. That gesture said everything. "I know. I'm proud too. Of you. of us, of what we made it through. But there was one moment, just one, that stood apart. A quiet exchange no one in the room could forget. He leaned toward Sharon, his voice nearly gone, and said, "When I go, don't make it about the noise, make it about the echo." A strange thing to say, maybe. But Sharon understood. The legacy he wanted wasn't just in the screaming crowds or the platinum records. It was in the stillness that followed. The ripple of every heart he had moved. The people who listened, who felt seen, who survived something dark because he had survived too. That more than anything was the promise he left behind, and it was hers to keep. In the end, it wasn't the screaming crowds or the blistering solos that defined Ozzy Osbourne's final act. It was the stillness that came before he stepped out one last time. Birmingham, the city where it all began, held its breath. It was a return, a reckoning, and for those who understood the weight of it, a farewell masked as a celebration. Ozzy knew it, and deep down, so did the fans. Over 40,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder to shoulder, not to witness a performance, but to be part of a final page in history. And somewhere beyond the stage lights, another 6 million watched, holding on to the kind of collective reverence usually reserved for spiritual awakenings. He walked slowly, cane in hand, Sharon steadying him at his side. The man who once defied gravity now took each step as if gravity had finally caught up. But when he reached the mic and the music began, something shifted. His voice cracked, his body trembled, but for those few minutes, he was whole again. Not the Ozzy of 1970 or 1980, but a man who had lived through all of it and still found a way to sing. He whispered to the crowd, "This may be the last time I ever stand on a stage." And in that moment, you could feel it, how finality doesn't always come with drama. Sometimes it comes with truth, plain and undeniable. But what came next wasn't a curtain call. It was a transformation. Behind the scenes, Ozzy had already decided that this performance would be more than symbolic. It would be generational. The earnings from that night, a staggering $190 million, didn't go toward a final tour, a new album, or even his estate. Every single dollar was pledged to causes that had defined his battle and shaped his compassion. Parkinson's research, children's hospitals in Birmingham, hospice care for the vulnerable, these were the echoes he wanted to leave behind. Not riffs, not headlines, healing, and that decision reframed everything. For decades, Ozzy had been a man clawing out of the wreckage of his own chaos. He had burned bridges, lost friends, nearly lost himself. But in this act, quiet, deliberate, and deeply human, he reminded us that legacy isn't what you build in your prime. It's what you leave standing after the noise dies down. How many artists exit the world with fire still in their chest and choose, instead of self-preservation, to lift someone else? That's not just generosity. That's redemption. There was a time when Ozzy didn't believe he deserved to be remembered at all. He once said, "I'm just a madman who got lucky." I was never supposed to last this long, but maybe lasting wasn't the point. Maybe the point was to change what lasting meant, to go from chaos to clarity, from screaming for help to helping others find their voice. That $190 million wasn't a donation, it was a declaration that healing matters. That music matters, that even the most fractured lives can still piece together something beautiful in the end. For the fans who stood in that arena, who watched through tears as Ozzy closed his eyes and breathed in the applause, this wasn't just goodbye. It was a moment of shared recognition of how far he'd come, of what it cost to survive, and more importantly, of what it means to give something back. The last note faded, the lights dimmed, and he didn't need to say anything more. The message had already been delivered, loud, clear, and unforgettable. It was a morning like any other. The world outside moved with its usual noise, cars, birds, clocks ticking forward. But inside Ozzy Osbourne's home, time had started to slow. It wasn't fear that filled the space. It wasn't dread. It was something quieter, something weightless. Except the man who had once defied death in every way possible now sat still in his chair, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The chaos had run its course, and what remained wasn't the storm, but the calm that comes after you've made peace with it. Sabbath riffs drifted through old recordings, songs that had once rattled stadium walls, but now floated like lullabies. Some said he preferred a changes in those final days. Others say it was Ordinary Man. Maybe it didn't matter which track was playing. Maybe it was the act itself of listening, remembering, grounding himself in the sounds that once made him feel infinite. Music had always been his map, his compass, and now it was his way home. Around him, life hummed gently. His grandchildren, unaware of the gravity in the air, played on the rug at his feet. Laughter bubbled up now and then, soft and light. They weren't mourning, they were just being, and that, more than anything, was what gave him peace. To watch the next generation exist without weight. Without the burden he had carried for so long. They didn't know the man who'd once hung upside down on stage or chased headlines with madness. They knew the man with the trembling hands who always smiled when they entered the room. The man who told stories in fragments and gave hugs like rituals. Sharon sat beside him as she always had. Not out of duty, not out of habit, but because her presence had become part of his breath. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. After all the years, the survival, the heartbreak, and the rebuilding, words had grown less important. She held his hand gently, her thumb tracing circles across his skin. It was a gesture she'd made 1,000 times before, but today it lingered. It was a kind of silent vow. I'm still here. I'm not letting go until you do. At one point, his eyes closed, not in sleep, but in reflection. His face was tired, yes, but not defeated. There was something almost luminous about it, a look of someone who had emptied everything he had to give and was now finally at rest. There was no fear in his expression, only softness, only stillness, only stillness. And then slowly he turned his head toward Sharon, leaned in slightly and whispered something. No one else in the room heard it, no one ever would. But whatever it was, it made her smile through her tears. Not a polite smile, not a smile for show, but the kind that breaks your heart because it holds both goodbye and gratitude in the same breath. We'll never know what he said, and maybe that's how it was meant to be. Some moments aren't meant to be repeated, they're meant to be felt. And in that quiet room, with music in the air and love all around him, Ozzy Osbourne didn't exit like a rock star. He left like a man who had finally come home to himself. Legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in the quiet choices our children make, how they speak, how they love, how they stand back up after falling. For Ozzy Osbourne, legacy didn't end when the guitars were put away or the lights dimmed. It lived on not just in music, but in the lives of the 5 people who called him Dad. Each of them in their own way carried forward a piece of him, not a performance, a presence. And in the final stretch of his life, that truth became beautifully, painfully clear. Clear. Amy was the first to arrive in his life and the first to choose a path away from the public eye. While the world leaned into the chaos of the Osbournes' reality series, Amy chose silence, privacy, her own rhythm. But that choice wasn't rejection, it was reverence. A deep understanding that some legacies need protecting, not projecting. Her music, though understated, carried an intimacy that mirrored her father's earliest pain. She never screamed into the world like he did. She whispered, and somehow it reached just as deep. In her refusal to perform the circus, she honored the man beneath it. Then there was Kelly, fiery, bold, unapologetically herself. She inherited her father's defiance, but shaped it into something uniquely hers. A fighter, yes, but also a healer. She didn't run from the spotlight. From fashion to music to her raw honesty about recovery and resilience, Kelly became the proof that pain, when met with courage, can become power. In Ozzy's final days, it was often her voice that filled the quiet gaps, her laughter that softened the grief. And though she had seen him at his most broken, she always treated him like a man worth saving, because to her, he always had been. Jack, the quiet one, evolved into something Ozzy never saw coming, a documentarian, a seeker of truth, a guardian of legacy. Sisters leaned into expression, Jack leaned into meaning. He turned cameras not on chaos, but on history, on family, on moments that mattered. He walked his father through hospital hallways, sat beside him in boardrooms, made sure the myth never drowned the man. Ozzy once called him the Watcher, and in the final chapter of his life, that role became sacred. Jack wasn't just a son. He was a steward, a witness to the slow, sacred ending of a story that had once threatened to end so many times before. Jessica and Louis from Ozzy's first marriage remained largely out of the public eye, but that didn't make their presence any less profound. They were threads in his fabric, steady and silent. Their choice to stay private wasn't distance, it was depth. Love, after all, doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives in consistency, in being there, in holding space when no one else can. And in those final days, his family gathered not for ceremony, but for comfort. Jessica and Louis were part of that circle, still rooted. What struck everyone most in those last moments was how unspoken the connection had become. There were no dramatic declarations, no rehearsed farewells, just hands being held, nods exchanged, a sense that the flame hadn't gone out, it had simply moved into them, into how they lived, how they remembered, how they would carry pieces of him forward in ways that weren't loud, but lasting. And maybe that's the real story. That Ozzy Osbourne, for all his madness and myth, passed down something more powerful than music. He passed down the permission to be fully human, flawed, fearless, and somehow still full of love. It wasn't discovered right away. Tucked into the back pages of Ozzy Osbourne's final will was a handwritten note, folded twice, fragile from time, but steady in its intent. It wasn't for lawyers. It wasn't for his family. It was for you, for anyone who ever turned up the volume to drown something out. For every soul who found themselves in his voice when they couldn't find themselves in anything else. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, but unmistakably his, and the message was simple. A thank you, it began, for giving me a reason to scream when I felt invisible. It's easy to forget that the man who stood before crowds of thousands once stood in his childhood bedroom with a rope in his hands, believing the world had no room for him. That before the chaos, the madness, the icon, there was just a kid who thought he had no worth, and yet he survived. Not because of fame, not because of luck, but because someone, somewhere, listened, played his records, sang along, believed in the pain behind the power. That note, in the end, wasn't just gratitude, it was confession. He was telling you with as much humility as he could muster that you saved him. And now he's gone. The lights have dimmed. The voice that once split arenas wide open has fallen silent. But the echo remains. It lives in the riffs you still hear when the world gets too loud. In the lyrics you recite without realizing. In the defiance you borrow when your hands shake, but you choose to rise anyway. That was always his real gift. Not music, not madness, but the way he turned survival into sound. The way he took the parts of himself that broke and used them to help others feel less alone in their breaking. Some legends go out with spectacle, but Ozzy chose something else. He chose meaning, a final act not meant to impress, but to connect. Because maybe that's the point. Maybe we don't need more noise. Maybe we need to listen to what remains when the noise ends. That handwritten note wasn't meant for headlines. It was meant to be found quietly when the roar had faded. A soft reminder that even in death, he was still reaching for the audience that gave him life. And now it's your turn. If you've ever played one of his songs during a moment that mattered, good or bad, if his music ever held you when nothing else could, say something. Leave a comment, share a memory, whisper a thank you of your own. Not for the sake of performance, but because sometimes saying it out loud makes it real. Because grief doesn't always ask for tears. Sometimes it just asks to be witnessed. Ozzy Osbourne is gone, but he didn't vanish. He became part of something bigger. Part of every late-night drive where music filled the silence. Part of every teenager who screamed into their pillow and found something healing in distortion. He became part of you. And that's the kind of immortality that no stage, no spotlight, no scream can compete with. So when you remember him, don't think only of the madness. Think of the man who found light in darkness and passed it forward. And when the silence comes, as it always does, let that echo remind you you're not alone. You never were. You never